Hello, welcome to Credit Careercast, brought to you by Highako. Today, Bob and Dave are back to talk about how to navigate the tricky situation of dealing with a problem employee. We hope you enjoy this conversation. Let's get into it.
Hello, this is Dave Schmidt, and I have Bob Schultz with me today, and we're going to talk about problem employees and various situations that you run into when you need to put on your HR hat and deal with whether it's an issue or short-term or long-term, or whether it's a situation where you trying to help an employee through their own situation. So there could be so many different things that come up when you're a manager and that you need to address with your employees. And so we want to take a broad look at this and some tips that you can use to better manage your staff, because that's what it's really all about, but also to help you in those difficult situations and work your way through that. So Bob, one of the things that we run into is when we have an employee and for whatever the reason, they're not performing up to the level we would hope they'd be performing at. So what's the first thing you do when you run into that type of situation?
Well, Dave, first of all, good to be with you again. When you become a manager, you quickly realize that the biggest challenge you have isn't making your numbers necessarily, but it's your staff, and it's the various issues that arise, whether it's internal conflict, somebody is not behaving properly, whether they're not making their numbers, and you got to figure out why, whatever it might be. It's just very time consuming, and you need to handle it in an effective way. So my first reaction is when I've had people that have performance issues or behavioral issues or whatever, the first thing is to try to save them, because they're a valuable asset to your company. Think about it this way. I mean, your company's trained them. They've been around for a while. They understand the lay of the land, the different departments, how they interact with one another, your processes. You've made quite an investment in them if they've been around for a while. And it's best to try to keep them if you can, rather than just react and try to replace them with somebody else. I call it intellectual equity. And I think that is a main consideration for why you should try to keep people on board, unless it's just absolutely impossible to do that. And the first thing I just propose is you do an assessment of what exactly is the problem here. Is it a training issue? Is it that they just lack motivation for some reason? Do they have behavioral issues that maybe they're not even aware of? Or are they a bad fit for the department? That is very possible too. Maybe they just aren't, it's not their long suit to do what we need done in a credit collections department. Or, you know what, in some cases, they're just incompetent. So you have to kind of assess, what am I dealing with here? And I think the best course is to try to address those things and try to save that person. I've always used the adage that you assign people to maximize their strengths and minimize their weaknesses. And what happens a lot of times, in my experience, is there's people that are in an assignment where it's the inverse. You're really expecting them to behave in a way that, is really maximizing their weaker areas, their weaker attributes, and they're strong in other areas. So maybe if you reassign them or you jigger their assignment a little bit, they could be, pretty effective. So the answer to your question, Dave, is that the first thing I would do is to try to keep them in the company if I could. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more on that, and absolutely agree with you on the idea that people are really part of your intellectual property. I think the problem that a lot of credit organizations face is that they're relatively small. So if you're a larger organization, it's very easy to, or much easier, let's say, to assign people based on their skill sets and to, allow to move people around and then take advantage of their strengths and weaknesses, as you say. And I really am a believer in specialization. I've done that, helped organize, organizations do that and seeing tremendous productivity gains from that when you put people in the proper roles. But a lot of small organizations, say the 2, 3, 4 person departments, everybody's doing a little bit of everything. And so, I think you have to help people with their weaknesses in those situations so they can at least get by in that regard. And you try to insulate them as much as possible. But sometimes, you just can't. I had a situation where I had an employee that came over from customer service, and she knew the company, knew the products, was, that was all great, but it turns out she was not comfortable with collecting. And and we worked on it and addressed it as much as we could, and the result was we both came to the conclusion that it would be better for her to move back to customer service when there was that opportunity, and that's what she ultimately did. She took a little bit of cut and pay to do that because we were paying a little bit more in our position. That's why she had come over. But it wasn't a good fit, and it came apparent. But the thing that happened there that I think made it work out well was the communication. So it was an ongoing thing. She was a new credit employee, so there was more than regular reviews on that just to make sure she was adjusting. And this problem showed itself early on, and we worked through it, tried to do things to help her get comfortable and get into the mindset of being a collector, but she was never able to make it. So we just moved on. Have you ever had any situations like that?
Oh yeah, I've had a couple that are kind of different examples of that. And you brought up a great point, Dave, and that is everybody has weaknesses, either because they don't understand something, or you can bulk that up with training or whatever, or they're just not detail oriented, and they're never going to be. But if you can help them develop those weaknesses and turn those things into acceptable, and you take advantage of all the things they're really good at, that's a big win for everybody. I had this one employee who I really, really liked. She was a wonderful person. We had her as a receptionist, but we had her doing a bunch of administrative things as well. And she just shined. Everybody thought the world of her. She was doing a great job. And we had an opening in collections. And I thought, wow, she has all the attributes for collecting: good communicator, organized, attention to detail, well thought of in the organization. So I gave her a promotion, and she moved into the collections area. And I met with her periodically because she never was making her numbers. And I kept meeting with, trying to train, trying to help. And finally, I called her in. I said, geez, we've tried everything, and you're just failing in this position. I can't keep you in this position any longer. What is the problem? You were doing such an excellent job in your other job. And she said, my husband and I struggle to pay our bills, and I just can't call somebody up and demand money. And I thought, wow, who would have ever thought that that's what was running through her head? But she was so uncomfortable calling customers, asking for money. We put her back in her old position, and she did well. I had another case where I inherited this young woman who was a recent college grad from a major university. And she was put in a position, it was an entry-level position. She'd been there for about a year and a half. And when I walked in, I started looking at what she was doing, and it was just unacceptable. So I thought, okay, I'm going to try and save her. I spent an inordinate amount of my personal time trying to save her, trying to tell her, do it this way, where are the gaps, let's help, blah, 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 blah. And this went on, and I finally, I can't do it anymore. And by this time, it was a young woman. She had broken out with severe acne. She was stressed. She was miserable. And I told her in that meeting, I told her exactly this. I said, you need to be in a job that maximizes your strong points and minimizes those things that really you can't do well. And you're in the exact inverse of that. And we can't keep you here any longer. I'm going to have to put you on the corrective action, and and we're going to accelerate that. You have 30 days to either resign or play it out. And it's between you and me what the rationale is for your termination, but you're not going to work here in 31 days under any circumstances. And she left. And I knew people that knew her, and she went into banking in a role, and she just excelled in a completely different company, unfortunately, but a different role. So it really is important to try to understand how you're deploying your folks. And at some point, the one thing that I learned early on in my career, Dave, and maybe you can reflect on this as well, is you have a tendency to let things go too long. And, you can't do that with these situations. You do your best, and then you address it, and you do it fairly rapidly because it festers. Your other employees know that somebody's not cutting it, that they're not carrying their load, or they're disruptive, or whatever the issue may be. And the sooner you deal with it, the happier the other employees are going to be, and the better your department is going to fit together and run. So I would suggest to people not only what we've been talking about so far, but also act quickly. Don't let it linger. What do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely agree. And I've run into those situations. One job I entered, it was a turnaround type situation. A bad ERP implementation had totally messed up billing, and needless to say, DSO was running something like close to 100 days. And we found out one of the workers was really just doing things behind the backs of other people and just causing a lot of dissension, in the department. And as it was, she was a long-term temp, so it made it easier. But as soon as we found out who was the cause of all this dissension, it was goodbye, and that was that, and things improved greatly thereafter, and everybody was relieved by it.
Yeah, and you think you're the bad guy, and you're really not. You're doing everybody a disservice if you just
firing people is tough, and I think we're getting to this maybe a little sooner than we expected. But I found out, you're not really a manager until you've fired somebody, and for a good cause. And because a couple things happen. For one thing, once you've done it, you're uncomfortable doing it. It's hard to do, especially the first time you need to let somebody go. But once you've done it, it's sort of empowering. But the other thing is, if it's a problem that you've gotten rid of, the rest of the staff really appreciates that, and they come to recognize you as being a real manager, not someone that's just sort of playing the part. And I found it helped in terms of working with the staff otherwise. It's sort of a rite of passage for managers, but it's something that you need to get over, and you need to do right. But I wanted to go back to what you were talking about with addressing the issues, and I think that comes from communications, and really constantly evaluating your employees. If you wait for the annual or semi-annual review, that's not going to cut it. I used to have mini reviews with my employees on at least on a monthly basis. And when you've been an organization for a while, and you have staff, and you've gotten to know everybody, you could sort of know who to let work on their own. You're not going to have any problems with them. And you can identify the people that you're going to have to pay more attention to. And so and so you pay more attention to those people because if you can help them perform better, that's where you're going to get your most of your gains in performance. And so there's a getting to know your employees portion of this. And for a new manager, my recommendation is to make that something front and center. I think you come in as new manager and you're all interested in doing process and improving process and things like that, but pay attention to your people. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, it's interesting when you come into a new department, the first thing you're talking to your boss or maybe the person that was the previous incumbent, if they're still there. And okay, what do you think about the people in this department? What, and you get some view from a management perspective about each individual. What I've always done then is I have one-on-ones. First off, I have one-on-ones to try to assess the person myself, let them assess me a little bit. And to understand, are there issues I should be aware of? What are your goals? Are there things that you think ought to be improved that I ought to focus on? What are those things? And then on an ongoing basis, you're spot on, David. You meet with them on a scheduled, not haphazard, a scheduled basis. Could be 30 minutes, would be an hour. And you talk about, what's going on, how their performance goes. And I always like to start with, you did really good in these things. And here's some examples. This past month, gosh, I got a compliment from sales about what you did here. But you're going down the highway and you're just going to the left of the double yellow line on this. And here's an example of where I think you could have handled that better. So specific examples, and they're recent, so the memory's clear, and you instruct on how they could have done it better. But you start with the positives, you're not alienating them, and then you tell them, look, this is what I expect. And that's really where it all starts, by the way, is setting very clear expectations and priorities so that they understand, and they you even go through the exercise of, what did I just say? Repeat that to me. What do so that that it really did a mind link with them. Another thing that I one of my favorite books, it's an old book, it's called Managing by Walking Around. And certainly if you have the ability to be around people, maybe you're back at the office and you're all in one place, makes it kind of easy, but you can do it virtually too. You can just check in once in a while. And what are you doing? Anything I should be aware of? Any help you need from me? That type of thing. And you get tremendous feedback. You really understand what's the pulse of your department is, and you're cutting off issues before they become, HR related kind of issues. And the last thing I would say, Dave, just in terms of a structure of how you can kind of think about this as a manager, let's say you have an array, let's say you have 5 people in your department and 3 of them are stellar. They're always making their numbers. They're independent. They come to you if they need help, but you don't really have to manage them very much. You really trust them. They're high trust individuals. And then you got the ones, that they're not doing so well. You give them something to do and they're late, or they misinterpreted what you want to do and it was wrong, whatever it might be. Those are lower trust people. So if you think of a continuum between low trust, not that you don't trust their honesty, but you don't trust that they're going to deliver, low trust to high trust, and you calibrate how you connect with them based on where they are on that continuum. And there's shades of gray here, but if on the extreme, the low trust, you touch bases with them very frequently. You give them very specific tasks, not general direction, and you give them deadlines. I need you to go through these 25 accounts by the end of the day tomorrow. I'm going to check with you tonight to see how you're doing. If you have problems, come to me. That's a low trust. A high trust is here's your cash forecast for the month. Figure it out and make that cash forecast. And if you have problems, call me. That's a very high trust extreme. So when you're feeding back to your employees and you're monitoring their performance and you're trying to make them successful, using that kind of a model really helps get you to where they are. And over time, hopefully the trust level builds up. So anyway, that's something I've always done. I hope that it's valuable. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that type of approach. And I think that's most effective when you work at building the trust between you and the employee. And, bad situations occur when you can't build up that trust. They get defensive and whatever. But if you can be open with them and authentic with them, as you said, you give the feedback, the negative feedback along with the positive. It's not one-sided, and you get them to really admit that they have a weakness or they have a problem, that they take ownership for it. Then you can help them. When they don't buy in, that's when the problems occur. And you need to work on getting that buy-in, that this is what we need to work on, and this is what we need to improve. And I think gradually, by doing that, that trust increases, and you make progress. The problem is that doesn't always happen, and when that doesn't happen, it becomes a long-term situation. And those are difficult to deal with, because you have an employee that's underperforming over time. Everybody else knows that, and that affects department morale and things like that. And those types of situations, if they're not doing anything blatantly wrong, it's like, I think sometimes you just suggest, hey, why don't you start looking around for something else that would suit
Well,
you
that,
better?
that's the other thing, David. In my career, I've had to actually fire very, very few people. The finesse is to make them realize this isn't somewhere they want to be, and that it's better for them to leave and to get a resignation, particularly in a litigious situation that we have in our business environment today. If you can get them to voluntarily leave, that's a huge win for your company, because you're not worried about them coming back at you with some claim. And it comes almost to a mutual agreement. It doesn't work all the time, but I've found most of the time when I've had somebody turn over, that we both knew it was time for them to go. So that's something to work towards.
Yeah, and that brings up the point that back in with the regular meetings and everything, you're documenting all of this. And so, heaven forbid you do need to terminate somebody, and it happens, you got to have the documentation, because that's going to back you up. It sometimes, some people I've had it, when I said, this isn't going to work out, we're going to have to end this. They basically agreed, that, it was no good. So, yeah, I haven't had to terminate that many people either. But you sometimes it's got to be done. The hardest ones I found, the hardest thing I found to do was terminating somebody when it was a layoff.
Oh, that's the worst.
Then you have to choose, and
I had to lay off 18 people one time. And I'll tell you, in the ensuing 30 days, I found every one of them a job. Every one of them. I was so broken up over it. That is the worst experience as a manager, is to have to lay off a good, solid employee. That's the worst, Dave. Let's just talk a little bit about when somebody's a real sour apple in the crate there, and you have to meet with them. You gotta, in my view, you got to be really careful. And I would suggest in certain situations, you have a witness when you're meeting with them one-on-one. Maybe it's another manager, not another person in your department, not another somebody at their level.
Well,
Maybe,
HR in many
and
instances.
or if you have an HR department, HR
Yeah.
certainly it would be the first go-to, but it could be another manager. But I would really recommend protect yourself. Have a witness if it's going to get very tense and very particularly tense and go the wrong way. Act swiftly so that everything is fresh that you're discussing, and be terse, be brief. Don't open your the more you say, the more you're going to get fed back in a court hearing later on. So you need to be very brief. And the hardest thing is particularly for new managers, I think, is to be blunt. Just be blunt. You just say what you think honestly without being demeaning, but just state the facts. And that's hard for a lot of people because it's very confrontational, and a lot of people shy away from that. And if you're trying to put them on an improvement program, you really get set some specific expectations and time frames. I need you to do this by this time, and I'm going to meet with you every Friday afternoon at 2:00, and we're going to talk about how you're doing. That type of thing. Because it'll backfire on you if you're not structured when you're dealing with somebody, particularly if they're going to come back at you for one reason or the other. You ever had those situations, David?
No, not quite like that. That's out of my ballpark. I'd never had the potential flare-up type employee, and was fortunate not to. But yeah, no, I agree with you in terms of what you're saying. Anything leading up to a termination, you've got to have it sort of programmed in advance and laid out, and know what the process is, even if you haven't completely told them, and you're hoping that something will change. But once you start down the road, you need to know what potentially is going to happen and be ready to take all the necessary steps. And you're right, it's brief, it's to the point. It's sort of like when you reject somebody for credit. You don't really want to get into the details of it, but sorry, we're not giving you credit in this situation. You didn't qualify.
You'd think that most credit people would be pretty adept at this, but when you're looking at somebody in the eye and you're hurting them as a person by what you're saying, it's hard. And you have to just realize that it's the best for everybody. And by not being blunt, not being specific, not being honest, you're doing both you and that person a disservice. And I don't know if you've ever had this one, David, before we get into actual termination, and we got a couple minutes left here. The other thing that I found that was the most difficult to deal with is when I came into a department, either as the head of the department or even as a consultant, and I'm looking at long-term employees, and I'm looking at their performance. I'm trying to understand their good and bad points, and I look at their reviews, and they've all been wonderful reviews, but that employee is incompetent and they're not performing. And now suddenly you're the one that comes in to give them honest feedback. And that's hard. That's hard to do. And it's important that you really step up to it, and deal with it quickly. What are have you ever had that situation?
Well, I was brought in on a consulting job specifically for that reason. It was a small company. It had a credit manager and one other person in the department. And the credit manager had been there forever, was competent, was friends of the family that owned the business. But so there was limited, the poor CFO was really limited, couldn't let this person go, but needed to improve them. But they had certain habits, and they were so rigid that they weren't adjusting to time. So I was sort of brought in to try to shed light on the situation and open their eyes. It's such a difficult situation. In that case, it was the CFO's problem, not mine. And I was basically, the hope was I could help turn the guy around in some of my recommendations, and they'd be used that way. And but also to give the CFO ammunition to say something had to be done to the ownership. Yeah, it's tough. And especially in this case, it's a nice person, someone who knows what they're doing, but how they go about the job was not effective. And and things were situation was deteriorating, and they wouldn't change.
Yeah, so that gets us to termination, and we've talked to, have your documentation ready. You have HR or maybe legal or even a union rep. I've had union employees before, and you have to have them bought into what you're going to do. And the timing's important. You want to do it with dignity. You try to time it a day of the week, a time where, if you're in an office environment, particularly, you're not walking them out in front of all their colleagues and being real obvious about it. But I think the other thing is, it depends on the circumstance, but I believe in watching them clean out their desk and walking them to the parking lot. I've seen sabotage. I've seen all kinds of things, yelling, screaming, infecting other employees. So you really have to kind of be strategic when you're literally terminating somebody. Anyway, I've had those experiences. I have one more war story that.
Well, so just before you start that, I'd agree with you that late in the day and the last day of the week, or late in the week always seem to be best. I know one situation where there were a lot of layoffs, and gosh, they did it in the midday, and what a mess that made at the company I was at.
We're so virtual now that some of those things have changed. I hate to see somebody get fired by text or even FaceTime or, Zoom. I think it's deserves much more personal attention.
I agree.
But I believe it or not, I'm not a perfect person, David, and I have one war story that exemplifies all of this. I was a VP, and I had an organization reporting to me, and down the line there was a union employee who never showed up for a 40-hour work week. This went on for a long time, and I kept getting complaints about this person. She always had excuses. She was protected somewhat by the union. Finally, I just had it, and I said, I want to see her hour report for the last 2 years. I want to see it. And it was horrific. And she always had some excuse why she wasn't coming in. And so I arranged with the chief financial officer of that particular division, and we went to the mat, went to the union. We finally, over a period of time, this had festered for like a year and a half. And we finally, we went through all the gauntlet, and we got approval to terminate her the following day. Well, that night was the big Christmas party for the company. This involved like 3,000 people. It was a huge event. And the company was giving away as door prizes. One of the things they gave away was a trip to Paris for a week. So the CFO and I were having a beer, and we're watching the festivities, and they started calling the names. And guess who won the trip to Paris? The lady that we fired the very next day. So that to me is like a prime example of don't wait. It was like a stab in the heart that she didn't have a job, but she sure had a wonderful trip to Paris for a week with her husband. So there you go.
Well, that eased the pain a little bit for her.
For her. Anyway, David, have we killed it?
No, I think we've covered everything, Bob. So it's been good chatting with you, and look forward to next time.
Yeah, me too, David. It's always fun. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. If you want to learn more on the topic, check out Highako.com.